participate. Let me speak about both Joe and Usti. Joe has been living, learning, and raising kids as a settler on Tiwa lands in and around Oga Poge since 1997. They co-founded Wise Fool and spent 30 years performing, teaching, and directing this social justice, community-based, giant puppet, circus, and street theater company. It's cool. Currently, they focus on making art for protest and community, organizing the Northern New Mexico, organizing with Northern New Mexico, showing up for racial justice, and collaborating with Three Sisters Collective on the Oga Poge land tax, which is coming soon. Usti, we have a long history. I actually have a long history with his dad. His dad is, he was one of the religious clergy who did a lot of work in Central America during that time. Usti was raised in Southern Tiwa territory, colonial known as Albuquerque. Yeah, they are a bodywork and community organizer with Anti-War Coalition, the Albuquerque Showing Up for Racial Justice, and the Hookup Harm Reduction Collective. Over the last 15 years, their organizing has mostly focused on migrant justice, indigenous and international solidarity, and healing justice. Usti likes long walks in the mountains and sharing meals with community to envision a liberated world. So welcome our two speakers. Just a little bit about logistics. There are bathrooms, unisex bathrooms on this side, and then male and female bathrooms on through the double doors. There's also some food there, so help yourself during the talk there's food, there's chips, there's coffee, so please help yourselves. So please welcome.
Thank you, Imam. Just as a heads up, we are going to be recording this event. We will stop before the Q&A. Is sound okay for everyone? You're able to hear okay? Great. Does anyone have difficulty with the sound? That's true. Good question. Yes, maybe they can. Is sound okay for folks online from what you can see? Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. Really grateful to be in community today. My name is Usti, as Imam Abdur'Rauf had said, and we want to give a big gratitude to the Minara Muslim community for what we do. Yeah, beautiful. Also, we are sponsored tonight by the Southwest Coalition for Palestine, the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition, Jewish Voices for Peace, Albuquerque Showing Up for Racial Justice, Santa Feans for Justice in Palestine, New Mexico Jews for a Free Palestine, Santa Fe Ad Hoc Committee on Palestine, and Northern New Mexico Showing Up for Racial Justice. Yeah. I want to thank you all also for wearing masks today. I know this is not a practice for everyone, and acknowledge that this is still an issue. I know several people right now who have COVID, and thank you for keeping us safe as community. Particularly maybe true for folks who are online. If there are disruptions, some of our tech people will boot you. So please don't interrupt this presentation. We probably will be posting the recording later. And so if there are interruptions, we invite you to watch it later. And then I would ask that you all take care of yourself. Some of the content that we're going to be sharing is heavy. I think that is probably particularly true for people who come from indigenous communities here, from Palestine, from racialized communities, and others who might be migrants or experience the violence of settler colonial states. All of us do, but obviously some to greater degrees. So if that means stopping to go outside or to go to the restroom, do what you need to, please, to take care of yourself. And then I guess to get started, we are on Southern Tiwa lands here, and this land has been deeply impacted by colonialism, as has much of the world. We know that the land, the plants, animals, including humans, have been impacted. And I think some of what this trip showed for me was the ways in which the consistent creep of colonialism impacts everyone, and continues to here with nuclear extraction and other extractive industries and so many other ways that it plays out and impacts our bodies. So deep gratitude to the Tiwa people who have been stewards of this land and continue to be, and to all Indigenous people who replicate the samud, or the steadfastness that we learn from our siblings in Palestine. I want to paint a bit of a picture for those who come from this territory or who are familiar and live in the high desert. Much of where we were in the West Bank was similar in the sense that there were like tan desert sands, similar to at the foothills. Thistle, small cactuses, short trees, soft greens, amidst the birds and the bugs, occasional other animals, and the relationship to water. Yeah, I know that not everyone is able to see thanks to this lovely shade structure that we are in nature, but just a reminder that if you want to look out and see the shadow of the trees, remember that we're not just in a building, we're in a broader world. And I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote just to kind of set the space a bit. Friday Fajr. From darkness begins the morning prayer. Some mornings donkey joins, others mosquito, cock, cuckoo, seeking forgiveness, fortitude, blessing. Holiest day of the week in Islam, Good Friday for Christians. I rise early, time of silence before the long day of shepherding. Israeli settlers harass shepherds and villagers more on holy days. For them, this is cultural warfare. Speeding around on ATVs and dirt bikes, or trotting on camels, living out their frontier fantasies. Sounds of construction blast through the valley as another illegal outpost is built, further encroaching on the town. The men take their goats home for Juma and a nap. We remain with a mother, teaching her young daughter in a floral dress this tradition held for generations. The two then take their flock home, and our little crew of international accompanists talk of birds till the men return. The invasive myna bird, brought to colonize lands the world over, flits by, one that aggressively displaces native birds from their nests, evicting young hatchlings violently. This bird has swelled in numbers, decimating the population of Palestine sunbirds and countless other native species. After a bit, the shepherds return. A donkey gets out its zoomies by chasing the goats in circles. We perch on the hills as sheep, goats, donkey, and their caretakers descend into the terraced valley. We track settler activity, discussing the settlers who don't know how to manage the goats and sheep they steal. Colonizers who do not hold ancestral knowledge of these practices and this land. Just after leaving sight of the village, an army truck and a group of settlers approach a villager, launching tear gas at him for simply existing in his home. A few of us go to be with him, our vehicles stationed at a distance watching. The rest of us remain in the hills till the shepherds head home for evening maghrib and iftar. After dinner and conversation with other villagers recounting the constant threats they face, especially on Shabbat, we're oriented to the homes closest to the settlements and settler roads, where evening vandalization and harassment are constant. Fences cut, lights and cameras stolen, families terrorized, We bunker down, a settler car up the road, shining its headlights on the house through the night. Lest we forget the tear gas, lest we forget the minor bird, lest we forget the evictions on land day and every day, lest we forget the shepherd girl, lest we forget the prayer. All right, if we want to advance to the next slide. Those were some pictures taken mostly in the hills. So obviously we can't give the full context of what has happened historically on this land. But I want to acknowledge that since time immemorial, there have been diverse groups of peoples who have lived and moved through Palestine, of many cultures and religions. And also acknowledge that much of the context started over a century ago with the 1917 Balfour Declaration by the British, when this territory was still under the Ottoman Empire's rule, in which the British were making the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France to divvy up the territory after the Ottoman Empire fell, and deciding that this territory, that is Palestine, would be under the jurisdiction of Britain, and with a vision of it becoming a Jewish nation. 1922 is when the Ottoman Empire fell. And at that time, the population of Jewish people was 84,000, and the Palestinian or Arab population was over 500,000. And then by the time that the 1947 partition agreement was made in the UN, deciding how much they thought the territory should go towards Palestinians or towards Jewish people, more than half of it going towards Jewish people, which was only a third of the population of Palestine at that time. The Palestinians rejected that. And later in 1947, there began to be significant violence by the Zionist militias, who had been trained since the 20s to be militias for the British to put down Arab revolts and the struggle for land. So then in 1948, the Nakba, or the catastrophe as it's known in Arabic, becomes a time where between 750,000 and 1 million Palestinians were displaced. And much of this was actually in the territories that had been allocated to Palestinians according to the UN. And in order for Israel to be recognized within the UN, they had to agree to the right to return of Palestinians and the compensation for all that they had lost. And that has obviously still not happened. So I'm going to skip ahead to 1967, when Israel then invaded the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and all of the territories that were under either Jordanian or Egyptian rule at that time, becoming kind of the overseers and having authority over all of Palestine, putting the Palestinians under military law. And so Israelis are under civil and criminal law, Palestinians are under military law. And that's just an important thing for us to bear in mind when we're talking about why it's an apartheid state, right? There were the first and second Intifada, uprisings by Palestinians to resist the conditions. And there have been many wars against Gaza over the years. And so just want to set that as context. We're not going to share a whole lot more about the history at this time, but there's so much more to learn, and really encourage you all to do so. So I'm going to pass it over to Joe to carry us forward.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, and everybody online can hear. Great. Okay, so just going to put my reading glasses on. Okay, thank you. I'll keep my eyes out there to see if I need to speak up more. All right, so we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to show some maps. So the first map is starting from the big picture. You'll see that It starts from 1947 when there was first land lost to Jewish settlements in Palestine. And then it moves across with the partition plan and then what actually happened and now how it is today. You'll notice on the far right here that even the West Bank, which is supposed to be Palestinian territory, is actually just a bunch of little patches separated. And we'll talk more about what that means in real life. And that little red circle at the bottom there is where we were located while we were working there. Since October 7th, of course, you know, our attention has really been focused on Gaza as it needs to be because there's genocide happening. But we're just hoping that by sharing the realities of what's happening every day in the West Bank tonight, that it will build sort of a fuller picture and a stronger understanding of the ongoing and systemic oppression of Palestinians by the Israeli occupation throughout the entirety of occupied Palestine. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, so now we're zooming in a little bit. On your left there, you can still see all of Palestine, all of occupied Palestine. And just to give you a little perspective, the entirety of Palestine is about the size of New Jersey. And where we were in the West Bank, down just south of Hebron in the left-hand slide there, that's about 35 miles. You can just kind of get a sense of how big we're talking here. And then in the right-hand side, your left, sorry, your left, no, you're right. On the right-hand side to you, this is the West Bank. The West Bank from north to south is about the distance between Albuquerque and Espanola. It's about 75 miles as the crow flies. So that's not very big. And without road blockages or checkpoints, it would probably take a little over an hour to drive from Ramallah, which you can see in the middle, to Yatta, where we were located in the south of the West Bank. But by service, which is public taxi minivans, it took an average of 4 hours. And the timing of that drive was dependent on the pathway the drivers would take that day, because they had to avoid roadblocks and permanent and flying checkpoints at any time they possibly could. So each time we traveled from Ramallah to Yatta or back, we had the experience of a sort of game of connect the dots. So on this map, if you can imagine trying to connect all the blue, but you can see there's quite a lot of space in between. So we would end up taking incredibly circuitous routes to go between these intentionally isolated Palestinian communities. This could include dirt paths, zigzagging through tiny villages. I'm sure we went on people's driveways a few times, and we went through riverbeds. We would drive down into a that had a very, very New Mexico vibe. And it was just always a task to piece together a route that would get us there as safely as and quickly as possible. So next slide. On this slide, it's also the West Bank, but in this slide, we're going to look at the different areas of the West Bank. So the occupied West Bank was divided into 3 areas or administrative zones as part of the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s. The Palestinian Authority has limited powers of governance in area A and B. So those are the blue and gray areas. These are considered to be mainly urban or, quote, Palestinian enclave areas. And the remainder of that entire map, all that's in the orange, is area C. It's over 60% of the land, and it's also where all the illegal settlements are. Area C is under complete administrative and military control of Israel, which means they control the economy, they control civil and security matters, and as Yusti mentioned, they also, Palestinians are always under military control. They don't have an experience of civil or criminal court or anything like that. It's direct to the military. So in the small blue map, you'll see there in the center at the bottom, that is the dotted red line, the bigger red kind of odd shaped line, is the firing zone 918. This was created in the 1980s, and it included over 16 Palestinian villages. There's a lot more communities than that, but those are official villages. And these families have been facing expulsion and awaiting ruling on their court cases for over 40 years. In the late 70s, Ariel Sharon explained, quote, "Firing zones were created for one purpose, land reserves for settlements." So literally the firing zones are military zones that are created so they can have an excuse to kick Palestinians off their land. 2 years ago, the Israeli High Court gave the army the green light to demolish and displace over 1,000 Palestinians living in 8 of the communities in the Masafer Yatta area. And that circle of red is where we were located and the communities that we mostly spent time in. And that's kind of the Masafer Yatta area that you're looking at. All right, next slide.
Thank you, Joe. So as you're hearing from Joe, and as is just important to make these connections, this is obviously settler colonialism at play. And Patrick Wolf, a scholar and historian, had talked about invasion at that time was the framing that he used as a structure, not an event. And that is something that a number of people in more recent times, particularly Indigenous scholars, have talked about. Dad, would you mind grabbing some chairs as well from here? Thank you. So a number of Indigenous folks in particular talk about settler colonialism as a process. And that is something that we have really seen the process play out through our time there, as well as historically, right? And Ilan Pape, who's a Palestinian historian, talks about it as incremental genocide. The ways in which what we understood here on Turtle Island as manifest destiny had played out. So the way that we see that happen in Palestine is particularly disadvantaged extremist settlers do the dirty work and give political cover for state violence. So what that means is particularly young people, maybe who have not done as well in school, are told, join groups like the Hilltop Youth, which is an extremist group that then goes and terrorizes communities. We also saw that there were a number of Ethiopian Jews who were brought into the Israeli occupation forces, which is the army, right, the IOF. And so many ways in which people who are more marginalized within Israeli society are the ones that are put in the task of advancing the colonial project against the Palestinians. Some of them are sanctioned, and that gives the sense of like, oh, well, those are the extremists, so everything that the state is doing is okay. And one of the ways that we saw this play out this year is that there have been 162 demolitions in the West Bank alone under the pretext of unlawful construction. So it's not possible, essentially. I think 97% of permit requests for buildings are denied. And so even building something so simple as a volleyball court is considered enough to then come in and demolish the home. There have also been 5 demolitions that have been reported for punishment, which might look like a Palestinian who does something against an Israeli, and so then their home is demolished and everyone who lives in it is, houseless. Joe talks about firing zones. We can also look at how nature preserves, similar to the way that national parks were used here to take land. Similarly, we heard how archaeological sites are just created out of nothing, right? Like the story will be, okay, there was this important Jewish father who was in this place, and so now we have to displace everyone from the community. Or we want to show what the historic Jewish practices of farming were, and so we're going to displace the Palestinians who are doing the very same thing to then make it look like this is a novel thing that we're showing that is not something that happens every single day. I think you can go to the next slide, Leona. Another way that this is played out is through the protected species, which is on the left-hand side is a kub, and then on the right is a kind of wild thyme. It's not the same as the za'atar that is often used as a spice, but these are two very important spices for Palestinians, and they've been considered protected species, which cannot be harvested and can, result in jail time or fines or other things for having them. And then in the middle, we have a goat that we got to see born while we were shepherding, and walk within 5 minutes, something like that. But there was the black goat law that also had passed shortly after the Nakba, in which having black goats, which was one of the traditional Palestinian goats, was considered problematic because the settlers who came in and cut down olive trees and then brought in pine trees were finding that their pine trees were being eaten by the black goats. And so they forbade them and started to bring in European white goats as the replacement, slaughtering the black goats. So, just looking at these ways in which all of the little structures, all of the little ways of having access to food, access to the land, access to medicine, access to ceremonial practices, access to a way of connection and relationship with a place and community have been cut off. Next slide.
So, as Yusuf was saying just now, all of those things are part of daily life under apartheid. So, what you're seeing here is the image of a river polluted with raw settlement sewage. It runs through a once pristine valley where Palestinians graze their sheep and goats, and where they grow beautiful fields of waving grains of barley and wheat. And now in the middle of it, there's this incredibly smelly river that goes through. On the other side here is the firing zone rock. So all over the firing zone, there's these rocks that just have an X carved in them that are painted red, just to remind you that your land is now a firing zone. And also for them to be able to say that you knew you weren't supposed to be there. And then in the center is this sign that you see everywhere. It's really a disturbing sign, but every time you go in and out of a Palestinian area, there's a sign that says that it's dangerous to your life, forbidden and illegal to enter this zone, especially if you're Israeli. So as we can see, dehumanization is central to apartheid. Everything is about making everyone, including the Palestinians themselves, believe that you're less deserving, you're less worthy, you're less intelligent, you're incapable of feeling, you're less in need of healthcare, less in need of clean water or food. Basically, you're less than human. And that's the whole structure of apartheid. So that's why on this slide, I included this quote at the bottom from a Palestinian father who we spent quite a few nights staying at his house. He told us so many stories of his fence being cut so it would be easier to steal his sheep, of the financial strain on his family because he had spent months laboring to build houses for Israelis. But after October 7th, Israelis just used that as an excuse to never pay anybody. So he never got paid for building 2 houses. And his outdoor security lights got stolen, and then they would put them on the edge of the settlement facing into his own home, particularly actually into the room where we would sleep. And he said, it made it seem as if he's the aggressor to be feared and watched. And he said to me one night, When I read their propaganda and hear what they say about me, I too am afraid of myself. I must be a terrible person. He said that prophets a long time ago warned that from a distance, they look like a team all together, but as you get closer, you can see they're not connected, but rather each heart is beating alone. He told me with great pride that Palestinians' hearts are connected and beat as one, and that is why they can persevere. Next slide. Okay, so no freedom of movement. That's one of the biggest, most pervasive ways that Palestinian life is controlled, is lack of movement. And this is accomplished by roadblocks that pop up anywhere, anytime, and off-limit military zones. So the roads between villages are blocked by giant rocks, by concrete blocks, by bulldozed ditches, which you see here. And sometimes even the whole road is just bulldozed, which is in that center picture. The picture to your left there of the bulldozed road, that's actually the service driving away that had just dropped us off there. We were heading from the city of Yatta to the town where we were going to be staying. And that was as far as they could take us. We had to walk from there because there was a giant hole bulldozed in the road. That road used to be access for that village to be able to get groceries. It was like a 10-minute drive. And now they have to go 40-minute drive all the way out and around to the only road into that entire city that is not blocked at this point. And the IOF puts up checkpoints there anytime they feel like it. So it can take 40 minutes or it can take all day to now go get groceries in that town.
What does the IOF stand for?
The Israeli Occupation Forces, which is the army. They're officially called the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, but I can't really call them that because they're definitely not defense forces. So it's a word that I'm choosing. All right, so thank you for asking that. So this is the bulldozed road to a little village called Tiran, and UC will tell you a little bit more about that map. That's just an arbitrarily drawn map on a soldier's phone telling us where we can't be. So next slide. The apartheid wall, of course, is one of the biggest obstructions that are put up. It consists of concrete walls, fences, ditches, razor wires, sand paths, electronic monitoring systems, patrol roads, and a buffer zone. And its intended total length when it's finished is going to be 440 miles. Remember that from north to south, all of the West Bank is only 75 miles. So when it's complete, 85% of the route will be running inside the West Bank, which is of course contrary to international law. We here in New Mexico have a lot of experience being next to the US-Mexico border wall, and most of us understand that it upholds dominant culture. It destroys and displaces indigenous connections to land and each other. It degrades ecosystems, and it dehumanizes people who are, quote, from the other side. So we know well also that many of our ancestors here in New Mexico never crossed the border, it crossed them. That's the experience, of course, in Palestine. The use of the apartheid wall is to cloister and segment indigenous communities, and that's an integral part of the architecture of occupation. So the border wall here and in Palestine makes natural enforced migration and movement increasingly more dangerous. In Palestine, and it also justifies military checkpoints that are used to enforce profiling and policing. So many Palestinians have to choose every day between an education for their kids, because the school's on the other side, they have to go through a checkpoint to get there, or getting to work. As the father that I spoke of, every day he went to build those houses, he had to cross checkpoints in the morning and at night on the way there and back. So he had to leave before it was light out and didn't get home till it was dark out every day, even though it wasn't very far away. There's over 500 checkpoints in West Bank, and Over 8,200 Palestinians have been detained at those checkpoints since October 7th. And detained doesn't mean just like kept hanging out for a half an hour. It often means being taken to prison, possibly being tortured or beaten, not knowing when you're going to get out of prison, being kept on administrative detention. So that's a lot of people, and hundreds of them are kids. The photo on the left here is showing the apartheid wall in Bethlehem, and you can see how it's separating the olive groves from the Ida refugee camp. Those olive groves, the refugees used to be able to access those groves. The kids played in them, people harvested them. Now the apartheid wall separates them, which is another example of how the wall is used as a way to seize more land. And then in the center, there's a map that shows how the wall goes right down the main road that goes from Al-Quds or Jerusalem to the south, Al-Khalil, Yatta, and the areas of the south. So that has really limited a lot of travel because of that. But also there's a really sacred tomb, the tomb of Rachel, that is now enclosed completely by the wall, and you can only enter it if you're Israeli. So Muslim people can no longer go to this sacred tomb anymore. Next slide. After all that, I'm just going to go to some positive side here, which is that there's amazing art all over that wall. There's incredible, I mean, I have hundreds of pictures of the art on the wall. This is just a little bit of it. You can see Shireen Abul Akba. There's this beautiful window through the wall, and that's actually a little table and chairs, so you can sit and enjoy the window through the wall. There's things that are humorous, there's things that are very intense, there's a lot of honoring of martyrs and people, revolutionary people all over the world. There's Mandela, there's lots of great paintings. I just particularly love the one with the little kid peeing on the soldier, so I had to include it. And next slide, just some more art on the wall. And one of the things that I wanted to show with this art in particular is that all over the wall, there's references of the battle of Palestine, seeing Mexico and the wall and their struggles combined, and the intersectionality of these border walls. So this is one, there's like hundreds of paintings and stencils and stuff that's about Mexico on the wall also. I'm gonna pass it back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Leona, for doing your awesome talk. So I want to invite us to take a breath. Let our nervous system settle a little bit. Maybe look around and notice that people around you who you know and don't know. Looking out to see trees or some other sign of nature. I'm going to be talking about the settlers who we encountered everywhere all the time. So in this picture on the bottom right is a settler on a horse who came by into the land of one of the Palestinian homes and wouldn't leave. And so one of our comrades who was there was saying, like, go away, and trying to like move him back, and he just kept running his horse into her or trying to turn it so that it would kick. And these seemingly innocuous things like riding a horse or dirt bikes are never predictable when they're going to become violent. And so that's where even things like grazing, so on the bottom left, it's hard to see off in the distance, but near us is a donkey, and then off in the distance is the brother, actually, of the one who's on the horse, grazing his sheep. And so every day that we were there, he got a little bit closer and crossed over the stones that the family had set up to mark their current territory, because so much of their territory had already been stolen. And what he said to them is like, these stones are too short. If you want me not to get in with my sheep, you have to put it up here. So it's just this like psychological violence is also playing out. There would also be the green laser of guns shining into the homes that we stayed at night. We didn't witness this, but regularly the dirt bikes or ATVs or drones would be used to chase horses or to chase sheep and goats. And oftentimes some of them would die or would miscarry as a result of that. And so there's just this like constant threat against people. The drone surveillance would be constantly showing up. Like we would walk outside of the tent where we stayed in a community called Tiran, and they would have a drone fly by to see if there were internationals there. And if there were, then maybe they would just drive their ATVs up sort of close. And if there weren't, then like on Sukkot, which is a Jewish holiday, they would come up onto the territory with their guns, drinking, pull out water from the well, just constant harassment. And yeah, I mean, the list just goes on and on. The top right is a little structure that's being built that I'll reference on the next slide. Yeah. So the young woman here is looking out at a bus in the distance, which is maybe 2 to 3 blocks away. And that bus is an illegal outpost that was set up essentially to then make it impossible for her to go from her community to the other side of that hill where there were other Palestinian communities, because now there is a settler outpost that is present. And on the top left is a truck that her family had that was burnt some months back. And then while we were there, their only working truck was also burnt at night. They've had their well poisoned with gasoline, they've had their pipes destroyed. They never leave as a family to Yatta altogether, because when they do, then their house is attacked and things are destroyed. And even, I mean, this truck was set on fire while we were there. So, there's just this constant presence. Next slide. And one of the things that I want to highlight is Zev Jabotinsky, who is a founder of revisionist Zionism and one of the militants that was really fighting for the creation of the Zionist state, had said any indigenous people will fight the settlers as long as there is a spark of hope to be rid of the foreign settlements. That is what the Arabs of the land of Israel are doing and will continue to do as long as a spark of hope lingers that they can prevent Palestine from becoming the land of Israel. So I'm going to pass it back to you.
All right. For this slide, I'm going to read the dispatch that I wrote on April 4th. Some nights we sleep at a home where the eldest son was martyred. He was shot in the neck by the IOF while attempting to repair a generator that Zionist occupiers had vandalized at his neighbor's house. He was severely injured and disabled, but lived for over a year after being shot. His death was further hastened by occupation, as his family was repeatedly denied permits to build a room where they could accommodate his medical needs. They were not allowed to have a generator, nor were they provided with consistent electricity necessary for his life-sustaining ventilator. He slept in the cave where we now wait, with his face watching over us from a sign above the sleeping mats. The sign says, "She mourns the wounded martyr, Harun Rasmi Abu Aram, who rose after being hit by occupation bullets in Masafar Yatta." Thus begins another day of ever-expanding colonization, and with it, the constant daily pressure of violence that takes infinite and relentless forms.
And so it's important to also know that it's hard to differentiate sometimes between who is a settler, who is the army, who is the police. We encountered so many settlers who were dressed up in army fatigue. In the top left corner, the person with gray hair that's kind of blowing in the wind is a settler who is constantly harassing people. And on one of our first days, right? We went into a community and he drove up with another person in a military vehicle and drove onto a road. We were out with a couple of groups of shepherds, and the shepherds started moving away, and the two of us and one other person kind of stood between the shepherds and him. And he mockingly calls us over and says, "We free Palestine," and then says, like, "Come over for beer, come over for tea." And we don't engage, but after the shepherds have cleared away, we start to move back, and eventually he starts to drive the vehicle away. And we go up to see where he's going. He turns the vehicle around and drives right into the center of the village. And at that point, we're trying to figure out, what do we do? And decide that we're going to kind of stay close, because there's a Palestinian family who's come out right next to the vehicle and are asking questions, and we're doing the best we can. The other person with us spoke a little bit more Arabic, and was communicating with the family. And he calls in the army. And so the other folks that you see there are the army. And one of the guy who's closest to us in that picture, because we were all speaking in Spanish as a way to be able to communicate. And the assumption was that Joe and I didn't speak English. So he starts singing a Spanish song and like recording himself while he's doing that with us in the background. And it's just a joke for him. And that's, I think, one of the things that feels important to acknowledge, that the mocking and other ways of minimizing the humanity of people is part of the settler mentality of how do we take away other people's humanity. And so eventually we're talking to the army. We are given the choice of either showing our passports or being detained until the border police come. And presumably at this point, when the border police come, that means there's a high chance of being arrested. And so we showed our passports, and then we asked to see, like, what was it that we had done? And they said, well, you were too close. And we asked for a map, which is when the soldier drew that little map on his phone, which is more than they often do. And then we asked if he would walk us over and show where that was. We said, we weren't there. This person in his vehicle was parked beyond that line and trying to lure us over, but we didn't go. And so eventually they say, well, you're not supposed to be there. The Palestinians know. We're like, okay, we understand. And the army left, and then the settler soldiers left. But another week passed, and a couple of other folks were with the same shepherds. And the army came again and ended up arresting them. And when they were being interrogated, they just kept throwing out these accusations. Well, you crossed the line. They said, no, we didn't cross the line. They said, well, you were taking pictures of the settlement. And they said, no, that's not illegal. And then they said, well, you were interrupting a military operation. And it really didn't matter what the truth was. They ended up just being deported as a result of their presence there. And then, another week towards the end of our time, I was in that village again with another person, and a settler kid took his sheep through the field of wheat, and we started to follow him up the hill. And then his mom came in her vehicle, and other settler soldiers came, and then the army came with the border police, and were pushing me back. The guy in the middle is one of the border police, and he was super aggressive. And some of the other border police were saying, chill, like, Yusuf, you're doing too much. But they didn't sanction him, they didn't stop him. And he kept telling me and Rose, the other person who was with me, you stop recording, you're not allowed to take your phone out. And he was taking the safe on and off of his gun as he was standing over us. And so there's a lot of intimidation and a lot of violence that happens in many, many different ways. And then I'll just point out the patch on the one of the soldiers that's on the top right is the Israeli flag on half of it, and then the Punisher symbol. So there's just like all of these ways in which the threat of white supremacist violence is there. It's important to name that over 500 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed by soldiers since October 7th. Even though there's a completely different governing authority, Hamas is not present in any particular way. There's just so much violence that has really ramped up. And in the Knesset, which is their like council or Supreme Court, I can say that too. They said, no, it's not actually true that settler violence has gone up. Settler violence is 50% less. It's just that false reports are 47% more. And so anytime that Palestinians would call the police would not come, or very rarely would, and they would only go over and talk to the settlers to ask what happened and never take a report. And in the rare instances where they take a report, if there's an investigation of ideologically motivated violence by settlers in the West Bank, between 2005 and 2023, there was a study, and there's only a 3% conviction rate, whereas convictions of Palestinians for crimes is over 90%. And that goes back to it being under a military rule. So, yeah, I'm trying to think. There's just, so much more that I could share. But I think that I will leave it there and then share this picture, which is one of the other solidarity groups that is there, has a lot of tear gas canisters and other things that are present, just hanging down on a tree outside of their guest home. And part of why I want to speak to this is as we're starting to transition into talking about the resistance that happens, it takes many forms, and some of that is just acknowledgement of this is what is happening. We want people to know. And one of the Palestinians that I spoke with said, the settlers hate solidarity. This is why they're trying to get rid of you. And in the time that we were there, the Minister of Defense, Ben-Gvir, who was a person who was too violent to be accepted into the IOF, who's now the Minister of Defense, and deciding, along with another extremist who has lots of charges and convictions for violence, who administers the West Bank and what happens with the settlers, the two of them now have a task force in order to, quote, eradicate this malady and scourge of activism. The international presence and media interfere with the impunity of land theft and the murder of Palestinians. So, as we were wrestling with, is our presence important? Coming back to that question and recognition that they've created a task force to try and get rid of the Israeli solidarity activists and the international solidarity activists says, yes, it makes a difference for this to be witnessed and documented and shared. There are some QR codes I'm just gonna name if you all want that, or websites to contribute to some of these organizations, both ones that are doing on the ground support, as well as groups like Mecca that are one of the few organizations that are still going into Gaza to offer humanitarian support. And then trying to have support for other folks to go from here, because travel can be expensive and the cost can be expensive, but it's really important to get particularly US citizens there. Because of the visa waiver program, there are only so many US citizens who are able to be denied entry or deported until it caps. And that's not to say that they wouldn't extend it if that were a risk, but US citizens in particular have a little bit more sway than some of the other Europeans and other folks who are there as solidarity activists. That's you.
All right. So next slide. All right, I get to talk now about resistance. Yay. So the first slide here is about a protest in a village called Kafir Kadum. This village is just about 1.5 kilometers from the city of Nablus. That's the closest city to it. And 21 years ago, the road that goes from Kafir Kadum to Nablus was blocked. There was a court decision 14 years ago that ruled that the blockage was actually unlawful, but they have continued to enforce the roadblock till this day. As a result of that, the villagers have to travel about 10 times as far to get from their village to the closest city center. It's kind of similar to the situation I was describing in Yatta. So for the past 12.5 years, the villagers have marched that closed road every single Friday in protest. In the beginning, the army would respond by spraying skunk trucks at them. That's basically like a sewage liquid that is foul smelling, and they would spray that on the crowd, which is not only totally gross, but also a form of cultural warfare against a people for whom cleanliness is a spiritual and religious, an important spiritual and religious thing. So but then the skunk smell started floating into the settlement area, and the settlers complained, so they had to stop doing that. So then they started shooting tear gas and rubber-coated bullets at them. But since October 7th, the IOF has been shooting live ammunition at them, just straight up shooting at them. So they are the only village now in that region. There were like over a dozen villages who were having weekly protests. And this one village of Kafir Kadum is the only village that is still protesting every single Friday. And of course, they have a call out to have international presence all the time. So I'm going to read my dispatch from the day that I was. 656 Fridays of prayer and protest, 656 games of cat and mouse, pitting stones and hand gestures against machine guns, resulting in well over 100 villagers, some as young as 11, shot and wounded to date. The men of the village gather one by one on the stairs in front of a small shop near the mosque. They're drinking Arabic coffee from dainty little paper cups. They greet each other and await the midday prayers. This is the final 200 or so meters of the road that has been blocked. Beyond it lay a short trip to the closest commercial center, as well as olive groves and fields of grain that are now separated from their caretakers. Once his prayers are finished, a fearless elder man hoists his Palestinian flag on his shoulder and begins the walk up the blockaded road, past the soldiers staked out strategically on the hill above, their guns trained on the villagers. Military drones fly overhead, watching every move, while Palestinian children respond by watching from the rooftops. A young girl's bright pink sweatshirt glows in the sun almost as brightly as her smile as she waves down at us. Some days, slingshots launch rocks and tires burn. Always young men yell and make hand gestures, and in return, tear gas, rubber bullets, and since October 7th, live bullets are the soldiers' response. An older man with a long white beard and cane sits with his back to the snipers under an olive tree, steadfast and smiling. The lines of sun etched in his face like olive bark. His broad chest and girth echo the rooted solidity of the trunk behind him. Younger boys gather but are sent home when the protest begins. They await the age when their families will allow them to participate. The young men laugh and taunt with bravado, giving the soldiers the finger, hopping and skipping as they run to avoid being shot in the lower legs and knees. As we return to the starting point with no shot fired today, a sense of relief and resolve permeate the air. As we drive away, we pass burned olive groves and homes. IOF soldiers at their sniper stands sitting in bored tedium with hands on their machine guns, lookout towers, and enormous glass settlement buildings on every hilltop. Once back south, we learned that there were many violent settler attacks along our route today. One person killed, many injured, an ambulance shot at, many other ambulances barred from entry to help, dozens of houses and cars burned. And in each of these cases, the army blocked the roads around them to give backing to the violent settlers. Deep breath. Next slide. So every day that I was there, I would spend time just in complete awe of the calm and grounded strength that pervaded the laughter-filled lives of these villagers and families. I was in awe of the constancy of daily existence as resistance, or samud, or steadfastness, in their daily refusal to bend to destruction, dispossession, and erasure. So I wrote some things about what occupation looks like and what resistance looks like. Occupation sounds like drones and dirt bikes and ATVs. It feels like a constant pressure, both insidious and intimate, in its attempt to wear down one's sense of safety and basic humanity. Resistance looks like a father who calmly sits coloring stunning mandalas with his daughters in the cool evening hours after iftar. Occupation looks like the quiet morning hours ruptured day after day by entitled teenage settler shepherds, grazing ever closer to your donkey garden and home, until Nakba Day, when they arrive heavily armed to walk wherever they please through your house and then sit on your patio couch to have a smoke. Resistance looks like installing cameras and inviting internationals to keep a watchful eye and document all day and night, every day and night. It looks like gathering cousins and nephews for laughter and makluba, eating fresh almonds and drinking so much tea late into the night to celebrate Eid. Occupation looks like settlers coming onto your property in the night and uprooting your garden and chopping off all your fruiting trees and vines. But resistance looks like green, fresh shoots bursting around the scarred, tender trunk as the almond trees are nurtured back to life. It looks like the matriarch of this family planting a new bed of beans and squash as the kohlrabi and lettuce are readying for harvest in the next patch. Next slide. Resistance looks like driving your tractor to sell your milk and cheese in town because the settlers have bulldozed the road over and over again. It looks like your kids playing games with tires after making makeshift rock and branch barriers on the bridge to block the armed settlers from riding their dirt bikes through your compound just for fun. Occupation looks like the night sky being stolen by the searing brightness of settler surveillance lights. It looks like homes bulldozed and villages like Sanuta here left abandoned due to violent and forced evacuation. But resistance looks like painting murals on the walls of your home, your village, and even the wall that separates your refugee camp from the olive groves. It looks like continuing to stay in your home and pour love and care into the small bit of land you still hold and the beautiful children who you know deserve every right to their full and dignified humanity. It looks like the three sisters of Palestine, these red flowers, continuing to bloom bright red in every field and debris pile and in every crack in the wall. Next slide.
I'm gonna try to share a poem that I sort of am going to use my hands for, so we're gonna do the best we can. For the love of children. Maki balloon. Do I have balloons? La. Can I get? La. Maki balloon. Maki balloon. I don't understand. I'm sorry. I can offer polished rocks. Oh, but they're not candy. Look, this one glows in the dark. Look here in the dark of my hands. Look. When words fail, laughter, games, hajara waraka makas, not landing on a palm. Palestinian rock, paper, scissors is a fist thrown in the air, like the symbol of humble resistance that stones and words and olive cuttings are. Palestinian paper grasps the rock, not simply resting atop, a deed to the land not taken for granted, even when it's not documented on paper, but a birthright proven by centuries-old olive trees. I teach hands below, facing others above, to slap those on top, met with a version where one's hands start at the ears, bzzz, until you slap. Yallah, to pass the turn. Holding each other's wrists, I lift and spin a timid 3-year-old in circles, meeting me in wide eyes and grin until I return her to the earth and shyness. As sun sets, her family takes us down to plant seedlings in a garden where goats and settlers will hopefully keep out. I show a shepherd boy a snap finger helicopter. We send it back and forth as goats graze, sometimes a little too interested in the colorful plastic. A settler teen and his flock descend into this village's valley, loudly singing. We're forced to move back in this mind game of chess he was taught. We turn part of our attention to the game Spotted, until the shepherd boy's younger brother joins, drawing the exclusive attention of the Ajanib. That night after dinner with their family, we play with the 7 kids, snakes and ladders, Jenga, oldest sister stabilizing the tower as she pulls out a piece, avoiding the demolition her community knows too well. Whenever a tower falls, the siblings around grab wooden pieces to raise their tower higher to avoid the same fate. She says she hasn't a new outfit for Eid, delights in a ring I offer, soon after passing it to her sister to wear, a keeper of the peace and pillar for her siblings. Her family defies injury, kids precariously balanced on the edge of the sink getting water, using massive rusty scissors to cut plastic bottles and prickly plants, pickaxing an old fridge, twirling kittens. The day after Ramadan ends, a shepherd invites us home for lunch. His grandkids amazing at any circus trick we teach, balancing and climbing and flipping and working together. When we tire, they take out 2 Barbies, decapitating them to change their clothes. Carefully folding the removed clothes, putting them in the bag where the other outfit came from. The value of cleanliness and care clear in this small gesture. Hiding Barbies around the room, the kids scan like we do in the hills, looking for predators, especially settlers. The youngest, when her eyes aren't covered by her siblings, immediately alerts her siblings as to the hiding spot. In Kufr Kadum, 2 kids on a roof look out for soldiers. During the weekly protest, one in a bright pink sweater. They call out any soldier movement as we move into the firing range. Young Saber points to the smoothie on the milk container. We have no fruit to make it. Disappointed by the lack of sweetness, he calls again for smoothie, well practiced in persistence coming from a family of activists. He calls for Coke, not to drink, but to pour through a funnel. After missiles are shot down above our heads, metal shards landing nearby, he soon shakes his tears and fears, demanding help to balance water balloons in his sleeves, like hands, to show all gathered in the house as we await the next round of rockets. Hugs and tea and kittens when I return to a family's house after the army detains and threatens to deport me. Smattering of photos taken at half my height. Word exchanges. Kids eating around the few cucumbers and tomatoes until we catch on, saying we're full so they can have the rest. Peering out from heavy blankets across the room, no words but smiles and laughter. Calls on FaceTime where words are superfluous, love palpable. This poem is for the love of children, playing and laughing despite the occupation and fighter jets overhead, flying the 35 miles to Gaza. For the love of children in all occupied and battle-scarred lands. When words fail, know that you are loved. Next slide, please. So as we move towards closing, we want to give you some ways to support. Social media and writing, following and uplifting the Palestinian journalists, writing representatives, as tiring as it may be, and as many times as you may have done it. Also writing to the UNM president and the police chief to drop the charges on the students and community members who were arrested at the encampment, as well as to drop the bans on them from being able to go back to campus. We have the red flyers and scripts over here. Join an organization. It could be really important to do this work together collectively as we build movements, rather than be doing our isolated efforts. There are sign-up sheets at each of these tables for each of the organizations that hosted and co-sponsored if you want to have your information shared with them. If you want to go on a solidarity trip, feel free to talk to one of us and we can share more about that process and for funding. Joe.
All right, so more ways to support, talking to your family and friends. That is so important. We all have a sphere of influence and the biggest sphere is the one closest to us. So please consider sharing some of what we shared with you today with family members, with friends, and with other folks in your community. And vote uncommitted. Yay, I saw some uncommitted shirts happening today. I should have worn mine. Oh, yay, there's more shirts. You can see Sarah. So it's coming up soon. The polls are already open. June 4th is the last day to vote. You know, you can visit voteuncommittednm.com to get more information about it. But basically, it's a way of saying no to genocide, to Biden. And donate, of course, give generously, give often, give what you can, give in the ways that you can, give directly to families. There's many who have fundraisers trying to get their families out of Gaza right now. Give to on the ground organizations. We have the code for Mecca over here that you can just QR code, and we also have the website address. Also, folks doing humanitarian aid work. We have also a way to donate towards people who are considering going on the trip over here. And if anybody likes to buy art, I have a poster that I made that was inspired by the gentleman in Kafir Kadun sitting under the olive tree that was on the flyers for this event. And I have some of those signed posters over there that are hand silk screen printed, and half of all the proceeds will go towards international presence, protective presence work. And join the BDS movement. So if you haven't already heard of it, you can check it out at bdsmovement.net. This is a great way to just continue to support Palestinian resistance to this occupation. I think that brings us to a close. You want to go to the next slide? We're gonna.
Yeah, I think, so Samia said, the Palestinian American community leader was going to share some words. She's sick and not able to join on the Zoom. But Imam, did you want to share any words from your experience and kind of comparison? And then we can have the Q&A include Imam Abdur'Rauf as well to be able to look across time.
Assalamu alaikum. It looks like since 2003, things have gotten worse, not better. The things that I remember on that journey were the hundreds of checkpoints. So imagine between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, 50 or 60 checkpoints. It would take you hours to get to anywhere that you need to go. Imagine one of the incidents that we had was one of the elders had a heart attack and he had to go through all of those checkpoints. Well, he didn't make it. And this is a daily occurrence. Daily curfews at that time were like for 120 days. So what happens in a curfew for 120 days? Everything's shut down. Your shops, you can't go to work, kids can't go to school, access to hospitals are impossible. It's impossible to grow food when you're just being constantly harassed. 100-year-old olive trees just being destroyed. 1,000-year-old olive trees being destroyed. This is a disaster of biblical proportions, I would put it that way. We as Americans have to understand what is happening right now. Our tax dollars are being used to drop bombs on innocent children, women, and men. 75% of the casualties are children and women.
36,000.
36,000, almost 40,000. And I say 40 to 45,000 because the bodies underneath all of the rubble in Gaza have still not been discovered and still have not been cleaned up. As Americans, we have to understand that our tax dollars are being used every single day to kill innocent people. What does that mean to us as individuals? It should mean something. It should drive our hearts. Yesterday, an incendiary bomb, not just a regular one of the 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs, but an incendiary bomb was dropped in a Palestinian refugee camp. And most of the injuries, most of the deaths were, again, children and women. We have to become consciously aware of what's going on and try to do something, speak up, let our voices speak, let our votes speak, or the non-use of votes speak. This is a horror, and it's just getting worse. And it's not just an Israeli issue. I blame Saudi, the Emirates, many of the Muslim countries that are absolutely doing nothing to relieve the situation of the people of Palestine. It's heartbreaking to see that nothing has changed and that it's gotten totally worse. And that daily harassment on the West Bank has nothing to do with Hamas, has nothing to do with the situation in Gaza. It's just a constant colonial apartheid oppression of people who are native to that land. I hear Israeli Zionists say, oh, there was nobody living in the land. That is a complete, absolute lie. That part of the world, since the 7th century, was part of the Islamic Caliphate. Okay? So for 1,500 years, one of the holiest places on the face of the earth for Christians, Jews, and Muslims was not occupied. That's an absolute lie. It's an absolute lie. What you see is the dismantling of a people, of a country, of a culture. After the Turkish Empire lost the war, they went in and divvied up the land, just like they did in Africa, just like they did in South America, just like they did in America. This is one of the last colonial remnants, or remnants of colonialism that we're seeing. It's not a Muslim or Jewish issue. It's not a religious issue. It's a colonial Zionist issue where the Zionists have established a state in an area where people exist and live, just like in New Mexico. The native people lived on the land, and that land was taken from them systematically, and the culture was systematically destroyed. The language is systematically destroyed. This is what you're seeing in Palestine. And Gaza is just, what we heard about the West Bank, Gaza is just another complete level where all of the infrastructure has been destroyed. Buildings, roads, schools, Christian churches, mosques, hospitals, universities, you name it, so that it's systematic so that the people can never go back. And this is what you have to understand, that the Palestinian people cannot go back to Gaza. There's no place to go. They have to rebuild everything, roads, water, sewer, sewage, you name it, it's gone, it's destroyed. And the people now are left, over 2 million people are in a corner of Gaza. Imagine 2 million people being in an area the size of Albuquerque Airport, being starved to death, being bombed daily. This is the situation. You cannot be silent. You cannot be quiet. You can't accept that this is an issue between Muslims and Jews, because it's not. It's an issue between a colonial, Zionist, apartheid power and the indigenous people. Salam.